They didn't just sacrifice their victims, they wore them. In the heart of ancient Mesoamerica, among temples of blood and pyramids of bones, thrived a cult so disturbing, so grotesque, that even other civilizations feared them. Their god was Totec, the Flayed Lord, a deity of life, death, and resurrection. And to honor him, his followers performed one of the most horrifying rituals ever recorded. They skinned human beings alive, then draped themselves in the flesh and danced. The skin, still bloody and reeking, was worn for days. As it rotted and peeled, they believed it symbolized rebirth, death shedding into life. But beneath the theology was a system of control, terror, and psychological warfare. This wasn't just religion. It was a theater of agony, designed to keep entire populations in fear of divine vengeance. How did this ritual begin? Why was it celebrated across entire cities? And what happened to the priests who wore another man's face like a sacred robe? This is not just a story of sacrifice. It's a story of empire, of blood, of resurrection, and of what happens when death becomes the foundation of faith. Long before the Aztecs ruled the Valley of Mexico, before Tenochtitlan rose from lake and stone, there was already blood in the soil. The god they called Totec had no mercy. His name meant, "Our Lord the Flayed One." He was not beautiful. He was grotesque. Depicted with skin hanging loosely from his face and limbs, his iconography was unmistakable. A man wearing the skin of another, eyes staring through slits of a corpse's flesh. But he wasn't just a god of horror. He was also the god of agriculture, of fertility, of rebirth. This duality, death and life intertwined, defined Totec's mythology. According to belief, he flayed himself to feed humanity. By shedding his own skin, he fertilized the earth. Crops would grow only when death had been paid in full. To his followers, sacrifice wasn't cruelty, it was cosmic balance. Life came through death. Skin was more than flesh. It was the wrapping of divinity. His origins are older than the Aztecs. Some scholars trace the cult to the Zapotecs, the Mixtecs, and even earlier Olmec religious systems. Across these cultures, we find similar figures, deities associated with skin, rebirth, and the shedding of form. The myth evolved, passed through generations like a dark inheritance. By the time the Mexica, later known as the Aztecs, adopted Totec, he was already ancient and terrifying. Unlike other gods who demanded hearts or blood, Totec required a different offering, the outer layer of human identity, the symbol of self, the thing that made you you, skin. To prepare for his rituals, victims were kept alive for days, sometimes weeks. They were chosen for purity, beauty, or rank, tributes to ensure the god's favor. Then, during the Tlaxcala festival, they were paraded before the crowd, honored, and butchered. The flaying was surgical and slow. Priests used obsidian blades to peel away the skin without damaging the muscles beneath. The process was excruciating. The victim, still alive through much of it, would be flayed from the neck down, until death, shock, or blood loss took them. But death was only the beginning. The fresh skin was handed to a priest. He would pull it over his body like a cloak, the face of the dead draped over his own. Arms, legs, torso, all draped in the soft, warm flesh of another man. As the priest walked, the skin would shift. It would bleed, and the people would bow. They believed this grotesque figure was Totec, reincarnated through ritual. The priest, now possessed by the god, would bless crops, ordain soldiers, and pronounce omens. He would speak with the god's voice, walk with the god's feet, and for the next 20 days, he would not remove the skin. He would eat in it, sleep in it, dream in it, until it rotted, until it fell off in pieces, until the line between man and God dissolved in decay. The smell was unbearable. The weight of it, physically and spiritually, was crushing, but it was considered the highest honor. A sacrifice of identity, a ritual of transformation, and it was just the beginning. Because Totec was not a local god, his cult would spread like infection, through temples, through empires, through war. It would become state religion, a system of psychological control, economic coercion, and absolute fear. And with it came a terrifying question. How do you stop a religion that believes salvation wears the face of death? To understand how horrifying this ritual truly was, you must imagine the moment it began, not as legend, but as lived reality. The festival of Tlacaxipualistli began each spring in Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. It was the second month of the Aztec calendar, a season of rain, planting, and new life. But for the priests of Xipe-Totec, spring demanded death. War captives were selected first, young, healthy, strong. But they weren't dragged to the altar screaming. No, they were treated like honored guests. Fed well, given fine clothing, made to believe, in some twisted way, that they were part of something divine. And then came the mock battle. Each captive was placed on a temelacatl, a large stone disc, with one foot tied to its center. He was given a wooden weapon with feathers instead of blades. His opponent? A fully armed Aztec warrior. It was never a fair fight. It was theater, a blood ritual disguised as combat. The crowd would cheer, but the outcome was already written in stone. Once the captive was disarmed or incapacitated, the real ritual began. He was dragged up the temple steps. Laid across the Kuuxikali, the sacrificial stone. A priest would raise an obsidian blade, razor-sharp, volcanic glass, and drive it into the chest. The heart was removed while still beating. But that was for other gods. Huitzilopochtli, Tezcatlipoca. Xipe-Totec demanded more. From a separate chamber below the temple, his priests would prepare the next step, the flaying. It was methodical. The body, still warm, was hung upside down. Two priests held the arms. Another worked the blade under the skin at the nape of the neck. They peeled it slowly, starting at the back, moving down the arms, the torso, the legs. It took hours. And sometimes, especially in earlier versions of the ritual, the victim was flayed while still alive. This wasn't always reserved for war captives. In some regions, captured noblemen or enemy priests were given as offerings. Their suffering was symbolic, a death worthy of the god who once flayed himself. The flayed skin was called a Teoquitlaquetzki, literally, divine gold. It was holy, precious, a second skin that granted power. It was stretched and dried, worn by priests who danced through the streets, arms outstretched, blood trailing behind them. They didn't hide what they were. They celebrated it. Children touched the dangling flesh for blessings. Farmers prayed as the rotting skins passed by, and all of it was witnessed by thousands. Not in secret, in public. Because this wasn't a hidden ritual. It was state religion. The emperor himself presided over the ceremonies. The priests were state officials. The victims were war trophies, but also currency. The more captives flayed, the more powerful the city appeared. It was a form of political theater, spiritual terror weaponized to maintain control. Even among the Aztecs, the cult of Xipe-Totec was considered extreme. Some nobles questioned its necessity. Others embraced it entirely, hoping the god would reward their devotion with rain and harvest. The contradiction was staggering. They believed the earth needed blood to bloom. They believed that wearing another man's skin was not just acceptable, but holy. And in a world where crops failed and droughts crushed entire cities, people would believe anything if it promised survival. But what happens when a cult grows too powerful? When fear stops uniting and begins dividing? A deeper war was coming, one not of warriors, but of gods. To wear the skin of another man is more than grotesque, it's transformation. And for the priests of Xipe-Totec, that transformation was everything. After the ritual flayings, dozens of bloody skins, warm, slick, and still pulsing with the memory of the body they once contained, were carried to temples and chambers deep within the ceremonial complex. There, priests, often seasoned elders, would wash their own bodies in sacred water, smear themselves with ash and ochre, and begin the act that would turn them from man to god. They pulled the skin over their heads first. The dead man's face became a mask. Next came the arms, then the torso. A belt secured the hanging skin in place. The smell was overwhelming. The weight was real. But what mattered most was the illusion. Once clothed in death, the priest became the god himself. Not metaphorically. Literally. He was no longer a person. He was Xipe-Totec incarnate. And for the next 20 days, this flayed identity would be worn like divine armor. The skin would rot, stiffen, blacken. It would peel in long strips. Insects nested inside it. But the priest never took it off. Even as the stench grew unbearable. Even as sores formed beneath the decaying tissue. Even as the sacred garment became a source of infection and agony. He bore it. Because suffering was part of the ritual, pain was the proof of faith. It wasn't just one priest. Entire processions of skin wearers moved through the city. They danced in circles, mimicking the cycles of nature. They blessed fields, homes, and warriors. They visited families who had offered sons to the gods and anointed the grieving with drops of sacred blood dripping from the skins. They whispered blessings through slits in rotting flesh. It was a paradox of horror and holiness. Children followed them. Wives wept at their feet. The flayed priests were seen as conduits between worlds, walking corpses who channeled death and brought life. In some ceremonies, priests would sit in total silence, letting the skin dry against their bodies like a second, permanent sheath. In others, they would enact pantomimes, mock sacrifices, resurrection dances, and the ritual shedding of the skin, symbolizing the end of death's dominion. But not all priests survived. Some became sick from infections. Others collapsed from heatstroke or malnutrition. Still others went mad, believing they were the god, long after the skin had decayed and been removed. Because when you wear a man's flesh for 20 days, speak in his name, absorb the awe of thousands. How do you come back from that? Many didn't. Some disappeared into caves and mountains, convinced they had transcended mortality. Others were quietly executed, sacrificed as a final offering to Totec, to keep the divine cycle unbroken. It's easy to dismiss them as insane. But these men didn't see themselves as murderers. They were holy, revered, instruments of cosmic balance. They believed the skin they wore had power. They believed it made crops grow. They believed it kept the sun from falling. And that belief made them unstoppable, until rival gods rose, and cities began to question whether death was the only path to life. The cult of the Flayed One was never meant to stay in one city. It was a virus, spiritual and political, that spread through conquest, coercion, and cosmic fear. By the height of the Aztec Empire, Totec was not a fringe deity. He was one of the 4 major gods of their vast pantheon, alongside Huitzilopochtli, Tezcatlipoca, and Quetzalcoatl. And wherever Aztec influence reached, from the Gulf Coast to the Central Highlands, so too spread the temples, altars, and rituals of the skin-wearing priests. Every region adapted the cult in its own terrifying way. In Tlaxcala, rival of the Aztecs and one of the last independent city-states, prisoners were flayed publicly in the town square, not just for religion, but to strike fear into enemy hearts. In the city of Cholula, the largest pyramid in the Americas became home to secret rituals of dismemberment beneath its massive base. And in the coastal cities of the Totonacs, smaller temples to Totec appeared carved with grotesque reliefs. Men in mid-flaying, grinning skulls wrapped in skin like veils. Temples dedicated to him were often built from red stone, symbolic of blood, and aligned with the solar calendar. During the Tlacaxiphualistli festival, cities across the empire synchronized their rituals to ensure the god was fed simultaneously. At the height of the empire, it's believed that over 1,000 victims were flayed in a single season. This wasn't just religion, it was logistics. The Aztec Empire made the cult scalable. Cities were required to send tribute, not just goods, but bodies. Captured warriors, rebellious nobles, and unlucky merchants could all become skins. A well-stocked temple had dozens hanging from wooden racks called tsampantli, skull walls where the faces of the flayed dried in the sun. And the priests? They were not wanderers or wild-eyed fanatics. They were bureaucrats, diplomats, high priests and politicians. Their position granted immense power, because to question them was to question the god himself. The cult was useful to the state. Flaying was more than sacrifice, it was propaganda. It reminded the people who held the knife. It reminded them what happened to traitors, enemies, and non-believers. Even cities that resisted Aztec conquest often capitulated spiritually, allowing temples to be built in honor of Totec, hoping to avoid bloodshed by honoring blood. But it wasn't just fear that spread the cult. There was also awe. Many truly believed the rituals worked. After flaying, crops did appear to grow. Rains came. Disease abated. The priests claimed it was proof that Totec was pleased. And those who doubted, they vanished, or became the next skin. Some rebel priests even began competing with each other, each temple trying to out-sacrifice the other. The number of flayed bodies became a sign of prestige. Entire festivals became blood-drenched competitions. And the people? They celebrated. They danced. They sang hymns written in Nahuatl, praising the god who wore their sons. And slowly, Mesoamerica became a continent of skin and silence. But beneath that silence, tension grew. Because as the empire expanded and the body count rose, even the faithful began to ask, how much blood is enough? And what happens when the god grows hungry? Behind the rotting skins and ritual chants, behind the blood-slicked temples and screams, the cult of Zype Totec hid something even darker than death. Control. What began as a symbolic offering to a god of rebirth became a weaponized system of psychological dominance, a state-sponsored theater of terror used to hold an empire together. The Aztec Empire, like many empires, was built on conquest. But unlike others, it didn't simply demand obedience. It demanded flesh, and the cult of the Flayed One provided the perfect machine to collect it. Here's how it worked. When the Aztecs conquered a new city-state, they imposed religious standardization. That meant not just tribute in goods, but in bodies for sacrifice, especially for Zype Totec. Local rulers were forced to watch their warriors, sons, even priests march to the temples and skinned alive in the capital. It was a public message: resist and you'll be worn. Even allies weren't safe. To remain in the empire's favor, they had to contribute captives for ritual sacrifice. The Tlaxcalans, who resisted the Aztecs militarily but shared certain religious customs, still participated in the Tlacaxiphualisli festivals, not from belief, but fear. The flayed skins became currency, a form of tribute, a political performance. Priests gained more than spiritual authority. They held civic power. They controlled land, labor, and legal exemptions. In some regions, priests of Zype Totec were given absolute authority over ritual law. They could confiscate property. They could order flayings for blasphemy, heresy, or political dissent. Wearing the skin meant wearing the crown of terror. Some temples hoarded skins, drying and preserving them for future ceremonies. In Tenochtitlan, the capital, there was an underground chamber, a vault of flesh, where previous years' skins were hung like sacred relics. Some priests wore multiple skins at once, layering death upon death like armor. But not all cities accepted this quietly. Whispers of rebellion grew louder. Some border cities began sending sick or elderly captives for flaying, defying the cult's demand for strong, honorable victims. Others quietly sabotaged festivals, poisoning priests or stealing skins before they could be used. The cult responded with crackdowns. Spies were placed in the temples. Families accused of heresy were publicly flayed. Children were made to watch as their father's skin was paraded through the streets, then forced to kiss it for blessings. The psychological warfare was complete, and it didn't stop at civilians. Even Aztec nobles began to live in fear of the Flayed One. Court politics became entangled with the priesthood. High-ranking priests manipulated omens and readings from Zype Totec's shrine to influence imperial decisions. War declarations, marriage alliances, and royal successions were approved or halted based on the will of the flayed god. In one recorded case, a general accused of treason was flayed alive on the temple steps, not because of guilt, but because the god had spoken through a priest's dream. The lines between religion, justice, and propaganda blurred into one blood-stained truth. If you control death, you control everything. And for nearly a century, the skin-wearing priests did just that. But in the shadows, their enemies multiplied, because terror breeds resentment. And empires built on blood always collapse under the weight of their own cruelty. The cracks were beginning to show, and soon, the Flayed One would face a reckoning. Every spring, the cities of the Aztec Empire transformed into theaters of horror. The Tlacaxiphualisli festival wasn't a secret rite hidden in temple shadows. It was a public spectacle, staged across plazas, marketplaces, and ceremonial avenues. A ritual of rebirth, the priests called it. A sacred celebration of life emerging from death. But to the crowds watching, it looked more like the end of the world. The festival began with processions. Dozens of priests emerged from their chambers, dressed in the flayed skins of freshly sacrificed men. The skins still oozed. The limbs dangled loosely from their bodies like deflated bags of meat. The faces still intact, hung over their own, a grotesque veil with hollow eye sockets and frozen, lifeless expressions. Children cheered. Women wept. Some fainted, but no one looked away. The priests walked in choreographed steps, arms stretched, mimicking the god Zyp Totek. Their feet bled. Their bodies shook under the weight of rotting flesh. But they never stopped. For 20 days, they would live as gods in decay. And in those days, the city transformed. Altars flowed with blood. Food offerings piled up in grotesque mounds. Dancers circled the temples, smearing ashes and blood on their bodies in homage. Merchants wore miniature skin masks. Even the emperor participated, fasting, praying, offering tributes to ensure the gods' favor. Then came the games. Noble families were invited to sponsor ritual combats, mock duels, and sacred dances. But the final act, the one everyone awaited, was the shedding. On the 20th day, at the climax of the festival, the priests slowly peeled off the rotting skins in front of the crowd. By then, the flesh was stiff, blackened, and infested with insects. The priest's own skin beneath was blistered and infected. Many were ill. Some had lost parts of their fingers or toes to rot. But this was the moment of rebirth. The skin, once sacred, was burned in a ceremonial fire. The ash was collected and spread over crops and homes. It was believed to protect against disease, summon rain, and ensure the success of the next harvest. The priest, now reborn, would emerge weak, scarred, but transformed. Some never fully recovered. Others were revered for the rest of their lives. Because they had become Zyp Totek. They had worn death and survived it. But beneath the celebration was something darker. A truth few dared speak aloud. This was not a festival of renewal. It was a performance of terror. It reminded the people what the gods demanded, what the state could do, and what happened to those who resisted. And still, year after year, the people came. Not just out of devotion, but because they feared what would happen if they didn't. Entire villages were forced to send representatives, captives, servants, even children, to be present, to kneel before the flayed priests, to offer food and praise, to kiss the gods' feet as they dripped with blood. And all the while, the priests watched in silence, behind their masks of flesh, behind the smiling mouths of the dead. Because behind the theology and tradition was something more primal, the human hunger for power, and its ability to disguise itself as faith. But that hunger could not last forever, and soon, it would meet its match, not in rebellion, but in an empire from across the sea. The empire wanted silence. It wanted awe, obedience, and skin. But not everyone bowed to the flayed one. As the cult of Zyp Totek tightened its grip, whispers of resistance grew into murmurs, and murmurs into screams. From remote highland villages to the crowded marketplaces of Tenochtitlan, cracks formed in the foundation of ritual terror. The people had seen too much. The gods demanded too much. And eventually, someone said no. It began in the border provinces, the far edges of the empire, where Aztec control was weakest and local gods still lingered in carved stone and oral stories. In towns like Huexinco and Cuxtlahuaca, elders began hiding captives from the temple census. Local priests refused to send tribute victims. In some regions, statues of Zyp Totek were quietly defaced, his face chipped, his flayed skin smashed to dust. The response from Tenochtitlan was brutal. Imperial messengers arrived with threats and punishments. Troops followed. Rebellious priests were flayed, and their skins hung in front of temples for all to see. An ironic, cruel twist of their own ritual turned against them. Whole families were branded as heretics. Cities were cut off from trade. But resistance did not stop, because the horror was no longer working. In fact, the more blood was spilled, the more people began to question the gods that demanded it. Some even turned to rival deities. Worship of Quetzalcoatl, who rejected human sacrifice, surged in private ceremonies. Secret cults emerged around water and moon goddesses, whose rites involved healing, not killing. Farmers began refusing to offer their sons as tribute. Mothers wept openly during the festivals, no longer pretending it was an honor to see their children skinned for the harvest. The priests noticed. So did the emperor. And that's when a new kind of rebellion took shape, not just political or spiritual, but symbolic. During one Tlacaxipolistli festival in the city of Topeka, a young flayed priest walked the streets in silence as required. But he wore something beneath the skin, a blade. When he reached the temple steps, he drew it from the folds of the rotting flesh and slit his own throat, collapsing before the crowd. It wasn't suicide. It was protest. The message was clear: the god demands too much. The act sent ripples through the empire. Rumors spread of priests defecting, rituals abandoned, even temple fires set deliberately. Then came the weather. Years of drought struck the empire like a divine curse. Crops withered, lakes shrank, and still, the priests flayed and flayed, desperate to bring back the rains. But nothing worked. The people began to ask the most dangerous question of all: what if the god is not real? What if the skin never mattered? What if they had sacrificed thousands for nothing? Faith began to collapse. Not everywhere, not all at once, but like a body losing blood, belief began to drain from the empire's heart. And into that weakness stepped a new enemy. Not one of the old gods, not one of the rebellious provinces, but pale men in metal armor, riding beasts no one had seen before. Men who would look upon the flayed priests and see demons. Men who would burn temples not in fear, but in conquest. The Spanish had arrived, and the god of flayed skin was about to meet steel. They came seeking gold, but what they found was flesh. When Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors marched into the heart of Mesoamerica in 1519, they expected riches, resistance, and war. They did not expect the sight of blood-drenched temples or priests draped in human skin. To them, it was not religion. It was madness. And what they witnessed at the altars of Xipe-Totec would haunt their writings forever. Spanish chroniclers, men like Bernal Díaz del Castillo and Andrés de Tapia, described the rituals with revulsion. They wrote of flayed men, with their faces like masks of raw meat, of temples reeking with blood, and of ceremonies where the devil was praised with the skins of the innocent. But this revulsion wasn't merely moral. It became justification. The Spanish did not just want to conquer the Aztec Empire, they wanted to purify it. And the cult of the flayed one became Exhibit A in the prosecution of paganism. As they pushed toward Tenochtitlan, Cortez's men made contact with rival city-states, Tlaxcala, Texcoco, Cholula. Many of these regions still feared Aztec wrath, but loathed the skin-wearing priests more. So when the conquistadors proposed alliance, these cities didn't hesitate. The cult's own horror had created its enemies, and the Spaniards weaponized it. Every temple they found dedicated to Xipe-Totec was desecrated. Skins were torn down and burned. Statues were smashed. Priests were executed, some publicly, some without trial. In Texcoco, Spanish soldiers flayed a high priest alive, in cruel mimicry of the god he once served. It was not justice. It was revenge. In Tenochtitlan, as Cortés entered the city, he was brought to the great temple, Huitzilopochtli, where the most sacred altars stood. There, he witnessed the aftermath of sacrifice, piles of hearts, blood pooled in the corners, and the unmistakable stench of decay. And there stood a chamber, a dark, narrow room. Inside, dozens of flayed skins hung from hooks in the walls, like garments in a macabre closet. This was the sanctuary of Xipe-Totec. Cortés ordered it destroyed. What followed was chaos. The Spanish desecration triggered violent retaliation. Aztec warriors rose up. The empire struck back, and Cortés was briefly driven out in the infamous Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. But the damage was done. The skin priests had no more power to instill fear. The people had seen foreigners defy the gods and live. More city-states turned against Tenochtitlan. More temples fell. And in 1521, when the Spanish finally conquered the capital, the cult of the flayed one was snuffed out in fire and steel. The last known ceremony of Tlaquaxiphualisli was held in secret, months before the fall. There are no records of what happened, only whispers. Some say the priests performed one final flaying, then burned themselves alive inside the temple. Others say they vanished into the mountains, taking their skins and relics with them. But the empire was gone. The temples were rubble. And the god of skin was silent. Or so it seemed, because the Spanish may have burned the cult, but they could not erase its memory. The horror survived in stone carvings, in hidden manuscripts, in nightmares passed down through generations. And though the god no longer walked the streets in borrowed flesh, something of him still lingered, waiting for his story to be told again. The flames didn't just burn temples. They burned memory. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish didn't just conquer the land. They waged a war on the very soul of Mesoamerica. Every god, every story, every sacred object was a target. And no cult provoked their fury more than the worshippers of Xipe-Totec. The priests of the Flayed One had once held empires in their grip. Now they were fugitives, or corpses. The conquistadors, backed by missionaries, began a campaign of forced conversion. Idols were torn down and replaced with crucifixes. Temples were demolished stone by stone. Those that survived were buried beneath new churches, their foundations quite literally erased under altars to a new god. But the cult of Xipe-Totec was treated with particular venom. The Spanish saw it not as misguided belief, but as devil worship. The image of men draped in rotting human skins was so horrifying, so alien, that it became a symbol of all that was savage about the people they sought to civilize. Missionaries documented the rituals with disgust, but their accounts were selective and often exaggerated to serve their agenda. They painted the priests as monsters, the people as victims, and the god as a demon to be exorcised. But here's what's truly chilling. While they destroyed the cult's shrines, they kept its records. Some Spanish chroniclers collected codices, carved stones, and even ceremonial knives as curiosities. These relics were sent back to Europe, studied in monasteries, and filed away in cabinets of wonders. And then forgotten. For centuries, Xipe-Totec disappeared from mainstream historical records. Entire generations grew up never knowing that such a god had existed. That once, in the heart of the Americas, cities had danced beneath priests wrapped in skin. That mothers had offered their sons not for war, but for flaying. What replaced him was silence. In public, the people prayed to Christian saints. They sang hymns in Latin. They lit candles in chapels built atop sacrificial stones. But in the mountains, far from the reach of Spanish eyes, the old stories whispered on. Elders told tales of a god who wore faces, of a time when flesh was power, of the bloody spring when the earth had to be fed. And slowly, over generations, the horror turned to legend and then to myth. Modern historians only began piecing together the truth in the late 19th and 20th centuries, when archaeologists uncovered temple ruins, codices, and carvings long buried. They found depictions of Xipe-Totec, his skin peeling, his hands raised. They found altars stained with ancient blood. And they found something else. Buried in one forgotten temple near Puebla, archaeologists unearthed a pit of bones, all flayed in the same pattern, all arranged in concentric circles. In the center, the statue of a god, smiling. Even in death, the Flayed One remained composed. His silence wasn't surrender. It was waiting. Because some gods are not buried. They are only delayed. And sometimes, history brings them back. Not in temples, but in stories, in images, in memory. Those centuries have passed since the last priest draped in human skin walked the stone steps of an Aztec temple. The shadow of Xipe-Totec lingers in unexpected places. In modern Mexico, traces of the Flayed One appear in art, folklore, and even political symbolism. Masks inspired by the god's visage, faces stripped of identity, eyes hollow, flesh peeled away, are still worn in certain indigenous dances, echoing ancient rituals. These are not mere costumes. They are living memories, fragments of a time when skin was both death and rebirth. But beyond cultural echoes, the symbolism of Xipe-Totec resonates universally. He embodies the paradox of transformation through pain, the idea that suffering can lead to renewal. This concept permeates countless spiritual traditions worldwide, from the shedding of old skin in rites of passage to the metaphorical death and rebirth in psychological healing. Yet, there is a darker lesson. The cult's history warns us how faith, power, and terror can intertwine to justify unspeakable acts. When belief becomes absolute, morality bends. When the face of the enemy is removed, literally peeled away, humanity becomes expendable. Today, scholars debate what Xipe-Totec's cult reveals about the Aztecs. Were they barbaric savages or complex people wrestling with existential questions? Did the rituals bind society together or tear it apart? Could the horror be a mirror reflecting all empires built on sacrifice? The Flayed God also haunts modern imagination, appearing in literature, films, and video games as a symbol of primal fear and transformation. His image taps into something ancient within us, the fear of losing self, the terror of being consumed, and the hope of emerging anew. In a world still grappling with cycles of violence, domination, and rebirth, the story of Zype Totek challenges us to ask, how far will we go to survive? What masks do we wear to hide our true selves? And what price do we pay when we shed the skin of our humanity? The empire of the Flayed may have fallen, but its echoes remain, waiting beneath the surface, in the skin we shed, in the faces we wear, and in the dark rituals we sometimes dare to repeat. Thank you for joining this journey into one of history's darkest cults. If you found this story haunting and thought-provoking, please subscribe for more deep dives into the weird, dark, and shocking corners of our past. Share your thoughts and questions in the comments. What part shocked you the most? And don't forget to watch our next video exploring another forgotten empire of terror. Because the past never truly dies. It only waits to be remembered.